Hello, welcome to We Are an Easter People Part 3. Today we are going to be discussing the shock of the resurrection. And what I mean by the shock of the resurrection is this. For us, especially those of us who were raised as Christians, we sort of accept the resurrection as a natural part of our lives. The idea of a human being, Jesus, being raised from the dead and walking around, talking, eating, hanging out with his friends, it just seems perfectly normal to us, casual even. Well, of course he did. He died, and on the third day he rose from the dead. Okay, in fulfillment of the scriptures, right? Okay, yeah, we don't really bat an eye about it. But we forget how utterly bizarre that really is, and how bizarre it especially was at the time when it happened. And the best analogy, or the best way we can think about it being so bizarre, is imagine if your loved one died. I'm not imagine if your loved one died. We all sadly have had loved ones died. But then imagine if another member of your family or one of your friends came up and not just said, oh, I saw them. And we think, yeah, sometimes we, perhaps they visit us one last time to say I'm okay or something comforting like that. But no, they said, Grandpa came and had coffee with me this morning, like physically sat and drank. There's the cup. Look, it's half empty, and it has those 2 sugars and no milk that Grandpa always liked. And there's that half-eaten toast he had with me. We'd be pretty creeped out. We definitely find it very bizarre. And this is exactly the shock, the kind of shock that I'm going to be talking about today of the resurrection. Because we still kind of think about it in the abstract, because it was, in that sense, a historical event, right? It happened 2,000 years ago, and then Jesus ascended into heaven, and now if people see Jesus, they're seeing a vision of Jesus. The physical Jesus isn't necessarily coming to them, right? He hasn't returned in his glorious second coming, when he will come and bring peace and justice to the world. So it was very obviously bizarre to the first witnesses and to all the witnesses of the resurrection when Jesus actually showed up. And so even today, right, we will hear arguments from non-believers about why, of course, the resurrection never happened. And the 3 big arguments usually are that, in the first century, they couldn't really tell the difference between a dead person and a person in a coma, because they don't really have good technology like we do. So perhaps Jesus was just unconscious and in a coma when they buried him. And then he woke up, and that's why people saw him walking around and ate with him. So that was one. They were just wrong, basically, that he was really dead. Or that they were all hallucinating. The first Christians had some kind of mass hallucination. They were hallucinating, they were in hysteria, there was some sort of thing like that going on, and that's why they ran around telling everyone that he was crucified. That he was resurrected. And the third one, of course, is that they made the whole thing up. Now, the first one, that they just didn't know that he wasn't really dead when they buried him, is really sort of that kind of argument. I kind of say it's an argument from privilege. It's kind of a snobby argument. as though people without technology are stupid people. That if you don't have technology, you're just dumb. And that people in the first century could not tell when someone was actually dead or not. And we're dealing with a couple of things here going on here. Number one, we're dealing with Roman soldiers, for one thing. Roman soldiers who crucified people a lot. The Roman Empire was pretty much built on violent domination, right? They went around conquering people. That actually was how the Roman Empire survived. They were kind of like the Borg, right? If you're familiar with Star Trek, right? Resistance is futile, you will be absorbed. And as a matter of fact, that was how their economy survived. That was the force of their economics. It was simply that they expanded. They kept expanding so that they could continue to have more slaves, they could continue to acquire more land, they could continue to acquire more taxes. And that expansion was a gigantic part of their economic system. And so they were very good at war, and they were very good at occupation. And when you occupied someone, how do you occupy another people? Violently. You make sure they obey. And how do you make sure you instill fear in them? And one scholar put the definition of crucifixion so beautifully. Crucifixion was a public service announcement. This is what happens to you if you mess with Rome, if you rebel. And crucifixion was pretty much reserved for rebellious non-citizens. It was for rebellious slaves, for runaway slaves, and it was for insurrectionists. And so, for example, when Nero burned down Rome, half of Rome, and he accused Christians of doing it, he accused them of rebelling against Rome and doing so by supposedly burning down Rome. And he lit on fire some 6,000 Christians. So he executed them by crucifying them and lighting them on fire. During the Spartacus Rebellion, every one of the runaway rebellious slaves who joined the Spartacus Rebellion were crucified. And that was on the order of 5,000 crucifixions, just all along the roads. All along the roads, wherever you went, if you traveled anywhere in Rome, in that area, all you saw were crucified runaway slaves. All, just drive down the freeway, right? And there they are. There they are, your public service announcement. These guys were good at this. They knew what they were doing, and they knew you hung up there until you were dead. They didn't mess around. And if you botched it, then you, as a soldier, were guilty of disobeying orders, which was the death penalty for disobeying orders, especially for disobeying or could lead to the death penalty, and especially for disobeying the order of enforcing the public service announcement of messing with Rome, which then would create instability in the empire. They were not going to botch this. Josephus, the historian, mentions only once in the history of Rome that he had ever even heard of a remotely botched crucifixion. And that guy didn't live very much longer after he woke up. It was just, oh, wow, look, he's not quite dead yet. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. And indeed, in Jesus' case, they made sure by stabbing him, right? It's like, well, let's just make extra sure. We don't think he's had enough time quite to die, so let's just stab him to make sure. Secondly, with Jewish burial practices, you don't have the case of burying someone alive in the sense that they are buried in a tomb. and they're laid out on a slab after they're anointed and wrapped in burial cloths. So if someone were to wake up in the tomb, they could holler and someone would have heard them, right? Saying, hey, hey, help, let me out, I'm not quite dead yet. So people knew when someone was dead and when someone was not. It wasn't like they were stupid. It wasn't like they had no idea what death was, or when someone was dead, or when someone was not. Just because they didn't have our fancy machines does not mean that first century people had no idea what a dead body was, or when someone was not dead. That's silly. That's just silly. So that whole argument does not count. We know Jesus was dead. The Roman soldiers knew what they were doing, and they stabbed Jesus just to make sure. He was really and truly dead. Now, as for the other two arguments, were they all hallucinating, or did they make it up? Well, were they all hallucinating? That just doesn't make sense because, or was it that he was a spirit or a ghost? Well, that doesn't hold water because every gospel account makes it very clear that Jesus was a bodily presence, I should say. They sat down and they ate with him, and they drank with him, and they touched him, right? In the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene is holding on to him because Jesus said, stop holding on to me. She's touching him, right? When Jesus comes and sees everyone but Thomas in the upper room, and he eats with them. He says, do you have anything to eat? And they sat and they ate with him. The women in the Gospel of Matthew grab his feet. They worship and they touch his feet. In the Gospel of Luke, on the road to Emmaus, the two disciples eat with Jesus. Ghosts and spirits and visions and hallucinations don't eat with people. And the third argument that they made it all up is the least likely, as a matter of fact, is the absolute worst argument that you can have for verification of the resurrection, for arguing that, well, see, they just made it up. Because in the Greco-Roman world, and there's a scholar, N.T. Wright, Nicholas Thomas Wright, who wrote this beautiful book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, Christian Origins, which I got a lot of this wonderful material from. He points out that both in the Greco-Roman world, I should say, and the Jewish world of the first century, no one ever, well, at first in the Greco-Roman world, they never had a concept of anyone coming back from the dead, ever, 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 because that's just not what happened. You died and you were gone. Not in their literature, not in their poetry, not in their religious practices. You died and you were gone. If you came back like to talk briefly as a ghost to someone or some kind of apparition, but you never came back bodily. And in Jewish tradition, from the time of the Maccabees, we know that there was belief in a bodily resurrection, but it was one that came on the day of the Lord, on the day of Yahweh, on Judgment Day, and everyone participated at the same time. One person, not even the Messiah, resurrected first, but that did not happen. So it never would have crossed the disciples' minds to make it up, because that wasn't what was supposed to happen. That wasn't how it was done. So why would you make up such an outlandish story to try to verify that your guy is the Messiah? It didn't make sense, and it wouldn't have crossed their minds, and therefore And that actually points even more to the resistance of why no one believed the women in the first place. It wasn't just that, oh, they're women and pat them on the head, we're sexist men and yeah, women. But it was also because it was so incredible. But just like how I said at the beginning, if someone came and said, oh, I just had breakfast with Grandpa who died yesterday, okay, why don't you lay down? This has all been upsetting. We all would kind of feel that way. And number two, that wasn't how it worked. It works when God comes on the last day. That's when the resurrection happens. So when Jesus himself predicted, I will rise on the third day, they just figure, yeah, when we all do, okay, Lord. 3 is a symbolic number in the Bible, and it just can have the meaning of in the fullness of time. They think Jesus is just saying, I'll suffer and I'll rise in the fullness of time. And they all kind of think, like we're all going to do. Okay, yeah, Lord. They don't take him literally. They don't understand. It doesn't cross their minds. So it would never have crossed their minds to believe that this is what's happening. It's nuts to them. It's a shock. It's a scandal. Just like Paul talks about, the Christ crucified is a folly to the Greeks and a scandal to the Jews. So is the resurrection. The resurrection is even more so of a folly and a scandal because people don't rise from the dead. They just don't, right? But they do, and they did, and Jesus did. He was the first fruits, as Paul says. And that shock is the shock of goodness. It's the shock that brings our hearts back to life. It brings our spirits back to life. It shocks us away from despair. It shocks us away from dwelling on all the bad in the world and believing the lie that evil is winning. Evil's not winning in this world. We can listen to the news, sure, right? And think, oh, look, this bad is happening, and that bad is happening, and this is happening, and that's happening, and oh no, everyone's overflowing, and all the sickness is overflowing the hospital, and these people, there's a war here, and this crime has happened, and these people are dying, and oh no, and there's divorce, and there's this, and there's that, and ah. Hey, that's news. Right? What is that old saying? If it bleeds, it leads. That's because we're not hearing the good. The good is quiet. Right? People don't talk about that enough. People aren't sharing that good news. But it's happening. It's happening everywhere, all the time. If you stop and think and look and listen, it's everywhere. There's so much good in the world. People sharing, people opening a door for someone, people letting someone's car go ahead of them on the freeway, people being polite, people loving their child, taking care of their elderly, of a stranger in the street. People do good all the time. It happens. And it's never stopped happening. And it's always there. And that's what we always need to do, is look for the good and see that course of good, because God sees the good. Just as much as God sees the bad, he's noting for justice, but God sees the good, and he glows. And he smiles, and his heart warms, and that warms the earth as well. And so what we can do is let our good and our hope and our love and our hearts shine everywhere. We can live the resurrection every day. One of my favorite stories, Father Dan Danielson, the late Father Dan Danielson, used to be the pastor of the Catholic community of Pleasanton. And so he was the first pastor I worked for here. He was actually the first, that was my first job, teaching Bible study here, anywhere. And I remember he told this wonderful, wonderful story. And that was how one day two guys in their 30s came. They weren't a couple or anything, but it wouldn't have mattered, but they weren't. And they came to him, they were work colleagues, and they came to him and they said they wanted to join CCOP and they wanted to become Catholic. And he said, well, why do you want to become Catholic? And they said they had another colleague, a woman, and she attended CCOP. And so she was this very kind woman. She was always in a good mood. She was always really patient, she was kind of unflappable at work. Nothing really got her too down. Nothing got her upset. And so they would talk to her and they said, they talked to her about her life, and she said her faith really kept her grounded and happy and at peace. And so she went to church here, so they came to Father Dan and they said, we want what she has. That's how we live the resurrection. We demonstrate by our lives. We show everyone what it means to know the resurrection, to know that the bad stuff doesn't win, that Jesus is alive. He is alive in our hearts, in our minds, in our spirits, in the world. And then everyone will want what we have because they can all have it. Alleluia.